Child labour during the Industrial Revolution. In an earlier video, to which I'll leave a link below, I suggested that Christianity, in theory at least, got it right about children, at least more right than surrounding or preceding cultures and societies. They were able to appeal to stories that Jesus told about children and stories about Jesus himself interacting with children, in order to elevate the status of children from mere possessions. I emphasised that this was not always realised in practice, of course, and we're only too well aware of how some of those representing the church have treated children. This got me thinking, though, about the Industrial Revolution and the way that children were treated at this time. If you've read any Dickens, you'll have some idea of what I'm talking about. Oliver Twist, for example, published in 1838. Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in her poem The Cry of the Children, published in 1843, wrote, "Do ye hear the children weeping, O my brothers, ere the sorrow comes with years? They are leaning their young heads against their mothers, and that cannot stop their tears. The young lambs are bleating in the meadows, the young birds are chirping in the nest, the young fawns are playing with the shadows, the young flowers are blowing toward the west. But the young children, O my brothers, they are weeping bitterly. They are weeping in the playtime of the others, in the country of the free." Yet, in what regarded itself as a Christian society, child labour, often in terrible conditions, was considered justified for many years. Children down the mines, children in the factories. Before I get into the ways that this was justified, even on biblical and Christian grounds, let's be clear about the real reasons for this exploitation of children. Essentially, this was regarded as an economic necessity. That children had always worked to some extent on the farm or in the home, or maybe in the family business. But this was usually in the context of the family. There were chores to be done. But the labour demanded of children during the Industrial Revolution was a different kind altogether. The hours were long, arduous, the work often dangerous, and the pay pitiful. This work took place outside the context of the family home or the family business or the farm, and became a means for large-scale industrialists to maximise their profits. Whereas work on the farm, in the house, or in the family business may be seen as a valuable contribution to family life and a preparation for the years to come, working for an industrialist in the mines or in the factories was nothing more than exploitation for profit. The rapid industrialisation of Britain required a vast, cheap and flexible workforce. Children were seen as an ideal solution due to their lower wages and physical ability to perform tasks in small or confined spaces, for instance in the textile mills or the coal mines. And many poor families came to depend on the income that their children brought into the household in order to survive, especially in the absence of any kind of social welfare system. For these families, sending children to work was often viewed as a necessity rather than a choice. These were the real reasons. But of course, perhaps even those Victorian and pre-Victorian industrialists, as well as other good Christians in society, had their consciences pricked sometimes by this treatment of children. There was, after all, the whole suffer the little children stuff that Jesus had spoken about and which I addressed in the previous video. However, people are nothing if not ingenious when it comes to justifying their own behaviour. If the Jesus stories made them feel a little uncomfortable, there were other stories that they could appeal to. It was always possible, for instance, to appeal to the idea of work as a moral good, as character building and a moral duty. Many Victorians believed that engaging children in labour would instill discipline, responsibility and a strong work ethic, the good old Protestant work ethic, industriousness and thrift as virtues. Child labour was part of God's plan for instilling these qualities into children. John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, recommended child labour as a means of preventing youthful idleness and vice. Popular biblical commentaries like those by Matthew Henry, which was widely read during the Victorian period, stress the providential nature of Joseph's hardships. You'll recall the story in Genesis of how Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers. Well, this was character building for Joseph, just as labouring in the mines would be for children. Their suffering was preparatory for divine purposes. Genesis chapter 3 was again widely referenced during the Victorian period, as again in Matthew Henry's commentary, reinforcing the idea that humanity's toil over the cursed ground was a direct consequence of Adam's sin. This interpretation influenced broader Victorian thought, suggesting that child labour, despite its harshness, was an inevitable and even necessary condition of the human experience. So, child labour was both a consequence of the fall and character building. It was redemptive. The industrialists were in fact doing God's work by sending children down the mines. I come back time and time again to the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that shape our beliefs, our culture, our society, our behaviour. If these stories are told to us often enough and at a young enough age, they will shape who we become as people. Sometimes those in power can decide which stories become the dominant narrative in our society, and these can be used to justify behaviour and decisions that actually arise from entirely different motives. Child labour was in fact perceived as an economic necessity, just as slavery had been for millennia prior to this. But occasionally something would prick the conscience of people, and rather than change their behaviour and practices, they sought stories that would justify them. And, unsurprisingly, they found them. These worked, for a time, sometimes for a very long time. Fortunately, in Britain at least, this blatant exploitation of children did not last very long, nowhere near as long as slavery. However, this was probably less because the right stories, like those being told by people like Dickens and Barrett, not because these stories were finally being heeded, so much as because the necessity for child labour actually receded as technology advanced, and also as the general level of wealth rose in society, and with that, power. I'm pretty sure that if these economic changes had not occurred, we'd still be using the story of Joseph and similar stories to shore up the practice of child labour. Indeed, what stories are we telling ourselves today to shore up child labour in certain other parts of the world, as well as other kinds of oppression? What stories, on the other hand, will help us to change these practices? Stories that perhaps challenge the current structures of the global economy. What stories are we currently telling ourselves that prevent us from making these changes?